It was all the way back in the 18th century that Philidor first wrote that pawns are the soul of chess. Back then, this was a revolutionary idea, but these days all strong chess players know that knowing how to use your pawns is vital. And in this video, I'm going to be sharing 7 of the most instructive positions drawn from master level play that made a big impact on me, that helped me reach a rating of 2100 rapid on chess.com, and which I think can improve your own play too. My name's Nathan Rose, I'm the author of Chess Opening Names, and I'm also an enthusiastic adult improver. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, please click the subscribe button. I do all kinds of content on chess, so by subscribing, you won't miss out on any of the great stuff that I've got coming up. Lesson 1. Look to create pawn weaknesses in the enemy camp. This begins with understanding what the different types of pawn weaknesses are. So to illustrate, I've set up this position where black has got several different types of pawn weaknesses. On the B file, black has got doubled pawns. These are weak because doubled pawns can't defend each other, as opposed to a situation like this where at least the B pawn would be defending the A pawn, but when the pawns are doubled, that's not possible. Another type of pawn weakness is the isolated pawn, which we've got on the D file in this case. This pawn also has no friendly pawns on the neighbouring files. All the pawns on the C file and the E file are gone for black, and therefore this pawn is left to fend for itself. And then here we've got pawns which are connected, but one of the pawns is weaker than the other, and it's the backward pawn. The pawn on G5 is defended by the pawn on F6, but the pawn on F6 is left without a defender of its own. And because the G pawn has advanced beyond, and because there's no black pawn on the E file, this pawn on F6 is a backward pawn and therefore can be weak. So with that knowledge, let's move into our first example from master level play. It's white to move here in Vandenberg versus Kramer 1950. And here white can create a weak pawn within black's camp by capturing on C6, and then black captures back. And now this pawn on C6 is a backward pawn, one of the types of pawn weaknesses that we just looked at. Now the thing about backward pawns and all types of pawn weaknesses actually is because the player who has the weak pawn can't defend it with other pawns, they have to defend it with their pieces instead. So let's see how this played out. White looked to add pressure to the weak pawn immediately by playing knight to E5, and black had to defend, this time with the rook. Now white invaded with their own rook to B7, so even though white wasn't able to win the weak pawn immediately, it created opportunities on other areas of the board. We'll just see a couple more moves, because black looked to try and trade pieces, but even so, you can see that there's a lot of pressure on this weak pawn. And that's how you play against a weak pawn. You add pressure to it and force your opponent to go passive in defending it. We'll see more about that in the next example. Lesson 2. Target enemy pawns. I find this to be a really great way to come up with a plan in the middle game whenever you're not sure what to do. Spend some time looking at what your opponent's weakest pawn might be, and then look to add pressure to it. And this is what happened in the game Taimanov versus Sutin 1954. We can see here that black has got doubled pawns on the C file, and white looked to add pressure to them immediately with bishop to E3. Note that white does this before castling. I think a lot of players would castle in this position, but it's not the priority right now. Let's try and win some material instead. So bishop to E3 and then E5. That reveals the defense of the pawn from the black dark squared bishop, but white just keeps on adding more pressure and black is forced into defense. You can see that just with every move, white is renewing the threat on this weak pawn. And eventually there's no way for black to keep adding defenders in a good way, so black instead plays rook to B8, targeting one of white's pawns, which makes a lot of sense. So white just goes back, defending with the queen, and now we get the chance to actually win this pawn. It looks like that after the sequence as was played in the game that black is going to be able to win the pawn back with rook to b2, but white had seen far enough ahead to see that there's a tactic in this position. Can you see the tactic? Pause the video if you need to. Well, through the move knight takes e5, white does win the pawn once and for all. The point is that black can't take this knight because then queen takes is a fork of the king and the rook. So tactics always play a part as well, even in positional play. So in the game, black didn't take the knight and was just a pawn down. And by the way, this pawn on c6 is also very weak. So black had a lot of problems. The game lasted quite a bit longer, but from a pawn down, there was only ever going to be one result. White went on to win. If you're enjoying this video, please show your appreciation by giving it a like down below. It'll help it to reach a greater audience. And with that, let's get back to the lessons. Lesson 3. Try to rid yourself of your own pawn weaknesses. So we've just seen in the last 2 lessons all the problems that come with having a weak pawn. So if you have a weak pawn, try and trade it off. That's what happened in the game Hansen versus Helston 1996, where it's white to move and white has this backward pawn on d4. So rather than allow black to target it with moves like rook to d8, combining with the knight which is already targeting it, white just advanced the pawn and therefore traded it off and no longer has a pawn weakness in the position. Lesson 4. Weak pawns become harder to defend as more pieces are traded. Since weak pawns by definition aren't defended by any of their friendly pawns, that task needs to fall on the pieces instead. We've already mentioned this. So as more pieces are traded, it becomes harder and harder to defend a weak pawn. Our model game here is Gukesh versus Ding, Game 1 of the 2024 World Chess Championship. If we do a quick assessment here, white has this backward pawn on c3, which black is already starting to target. White, meanwhile, has some kind of an attack forming. White's last move was f5, looking to break through against the uncastled black king. And if that attack can land, that's really where white's chances lie. Black, on the other hand, wants an endgame. And that's why Ding, with the black pieces, offered the queen trade with queen to d3. Now, if the queens were traded, this pawn is much harder to defend than it was before. Pretty quickly, black is going to be able to bring the other rook to the c-file, and this pawn is pretty soon going to be indefensible. Aside from that, of course, that capture also forks the bishop and the rook. So many reasons why that capture would be very bad for white. And for that reason, Gukesh, with the white pieces, looked to avoid the trade via queen to e1. But this allowed another move, another very strong move from Ding, bishop to g5, hitting this important rook which is tasked with defending this pawn. I won't show too much more of this game, but take a look at it yourself. You'll see that pretty quickly this pawn on c3 was lost. Ding went on to win the game, a very important game psychologically, by the way, because going into the match, many people were saying that Ding was finished. He'd been playing terribly in the lead-up, it had to be admitted, and Gukesh was in great form. But with this first-up victory, everyone had to sit up and take notice that, hey, we've actually got a game on our hands here. But just remember this concept. This is the important thing. When you're playing against a weak pawn, look to trade pieces, just as Ding did in this game. If you've watched this far, it's because you want to improve your chess. I help ambitious adult improvers to reach their goals in the game, whatever they may be. So if you'd like to explore working together, click the link in the description below. It's at the top of the description or as the pinned comment, and we can see whether working together will be a good fit for both of us. And with that, let's get back to the lessons. Lesson 5. Prevent your opponent's intended pawn breaks. This position comes from Williams versus Adams 2018. It's white to move here, and I'd like you to think about what black wants to do. What would black like to do if black had another move? This is a more advanced example, and if you can get to the right answer here, then you're doing better than a grandmaster was able to do. Well, if it were black to move, I think black would like to play the move f4. If f4 could be played, then this bishop would be opened up, the rook would also have greater scope, and for that reason, I think white should have prevented that pawn break with the move knight to e2. A backwards move, which is always hard to see, but if you can keep this bishop locked behind its own pawn, and you can keep this rook reasonably passive also behind the pawn on f5, then white has great chances to go on and win this game. Part of this goes to identifying which pieces are bad and which are good. In this position, the bishop is actually a bad piece, stuck behind the pawn on f5 and also the pawn on b7. So you want to keep enemy pieces bad if you can, for as long as you can, and then move knight e2, preventing the opponent's pawn break, would have done just that. Lesson 6. Transformations in the pawn structure can create new squares for your pieces. We're going back over 100 years for this example. This is from Capablanca versus Vidmar, 1922. We can all benefit a lot from studying the classics. And here Capablanca, with the white pieces, captured on d5. So, how should black capture back? Well, if you capture back with the e-pawn, then black is pretty quickly going to find themselves a pawn down after bishop to d3, with two threats. One threat is to capture on h7 with check. The other threat is to capture on c6. Black can't defend both, which explains why instead black captured with the c-pawn. But now after bishop to d3, again, there's this threat on h7, which black really needs to deal with. And now the instructive lesson that I wanted to get across, which is that this opening of the c-file allows white the opportunity to invade with queen to c7. This move makes it very difficult for black to complete development. You can't move the bishop to b7 because it would just get taken by the queen. Bishop to a6 isn't possible either because that square's covered too. The knight can't move because that would drop the queen. So it's very hard actually for black to get their pieces to good squares. Let's see how Vidmar tried to do it. Starting with queen to b4, at least breaking the pin. But after a couple more moves, black is finally able to move their knight out and is hoping to be able to play bishop to d7. But then knight to e5 cuts across that plan too. So Vidmar played bishop to d7 anyway, but this fails to a tactical sequence played in the game starting with bishop to c2. Now this queen is responsible for defending the bishop. So you try and keep the queen on a square which still guards the bishop, but after a4 that's no longer possible. Black was forced to capture on b2, which loses a piece, and pretty quickly Capablanca went on to win the game. But really the instructive moment was at the start. It's by doing this change in the pawn structure. Capablanca could see that after this capture, which was pretty much forced, he was going to be able to invade with the queen and make black's position very tough to play. Lesson 7 is the pawn sacrifice to clear a square for an important attacking piece. This position comes from near the end of Yusupov versus Korea, 1985. White's got some great pressure along the f-file. Meanwhile, black's pieces are still on their starting squares. The only piece which isn't playing a role for white at the moment is the knight. The knight would love to come to the d5 square. How can we do that? With the pawn sacrifice d6. If the queen takes, then white's pieces flood in, and there's going to be a series of checks which eventually lead to checkmate. You can work that out for yourself, but trust me, black's king is getting mated here. And if you take with the pawn, then white's knight gets its ideal square, with tempo nonetheless. Black tried to move away, but then the threats keep coming. Knight f6 check, and then after knight to e8, black resigned, in view of the following continuation. If queen to h6 was played, white can actually trade queens now. Surprisingly, right? But the thing is, we can win a piece by force. This bishop can't move because it would drop the rook, and there's two pieces attacking the bishop, so this endgame is easily winning for white. But it started with the pawn sacrifice. It started with the pawn sacrifice d6, recognizing that the knight needed to come to the d5 square, and it was worth giving up a pawn to do so. Remember, If you'd like to improve your chess, click the link in the description below. It's at the top of the description or the first pinned comment. We can talk about your goals in the game and see whether working together will be a good fit. Aside from that, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, do me a favor and drop a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this one. And do feel free to leave a comment below as well. What was your favorite tip? What can you use to win more games? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time then, I'm Nathan Rose. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.